Conflict and Compromise, The American Civil War, by Claudia Dearing. The Missouri Compromise. The Missouri Compromise was one of the three major acts intended to prevent the Civil War. Like the other compromises, the Missouri Compromise allowed slavery to remain in certain states and not others within the organized territories of the United States. The northern states were considered free territories, while most of the southern states were considered slave states. But even at the time, many people, including Thomas Jefferson, did not expect it to keep the peace for long. In southern Virginia, a slave named Nat Turner incited an uprising in August of 1831. About 60 white people were killed, and the military crushed the rebellion after a few days of terror. Turner and 50 others were tried and executed for their role, and about 200 more were lynched by mobs. Virginia lawmakers reacted to the bloody uprising by rolling back the few rights slaves and free black people had. The Compromise of 1850. The Compromise of 1850 was the second of the several major compromises intended to prevent the Civil War. It prevented slavery in the expanding territories to the west, but it also compelled northern states to seize and return slaves that escaped back to the south. While the compromise was somewhat successful in delaying the issues that divided the North and the South from escalating, it was also destined to fail. The resulting disorder and chaos that occurred from the disparity that divided the United States wasn't sustainable. The Kansas-Nebraska Act. The Kansas-Nebraska Act mandated popular sovereignty, which was intended to allow states to decide for themselves whether or not slavery would be legal. This act basically overturned the Missouri Compromise and increased violence between pro- and anti-slavery settlers in a period of time known as Bleeding Kansas. This helped pave the way for the Civil War. Abraham Lincoln is elected and South Carolina secedes. Despite not being included on many Southern ballots, Abraham Lincoln was elected by a large margin in 1860. About a month later, South Carolina secedes from the Union. 6 more states followed by the spring of 1861. The Battle of Fort Sumter. The first conflict of the Civil War was the Battle of Fort Sumter in April of 1861. The southern outpost was denied supplies by an intercepting Confederate warship. A 34-hour bombardment followed, and the garrison surrendered on April 14th. The Civil War was underway, unwilling to contribute troops to the Northern Army. Virginia, Arkansas, North Carolina, and Tennessee dissolved their ties to the federal government. Like other wars, the Civil War included many battles over the course of the 4-year conflict. Previous compromises that were attempted between the North and the South had failed, and no real effort to compromise seemed evident in the bloody years that followed. However, each side experienced their own internal conflicts and compromises. Conflicts between Abraham Lincoln and his generals. General George Hooker served the North in the Army of the Potomac. He was a controversial person who indulged in drinking, womanizing, and being highly critical of other officers. He thought Lincoln's administration was too slow-moving and said that the country needed a dictator. Lincoln, however, neither feared criticism nor overly engaged in it. In a letter acknowledging Hooker for his behavior in undermining another officer, Lincoln also praised Hooker for his strengths and talents. I believe you to be a brave and skillful soldier, which of course I like. I also believe you do not mix politics with your profession, in which you are right. You have confidence in yourself, which is valuable. I have heard, in such a way as to believe it, of your recently saying that both the army and the government needed a dictator. Of course it was not for this, but in spite of it, that I have given you the command. Only those generals who gain success can set up dictators. What I now ask of you is military success, and I will risk the dictatorship. While Hooker thought the letter was harsh, it also endeared him to Lincoln. That is just such a letter as a father might write to his son, he explained. It is a beautiful letter, and although I think he was harder on me than I deserved, I will say that I love the man who wrote it. Lincoln's compromise was successful in retaining the service of General Hooker for a while, but the general was not overly successful and was replaced a short time later. On another occasion of a conflict with one of his generals, Lincoln wrote to General Meade in much harsher tones than in his letter to Hooker. Furious over his refusal to attack Robert E. Lee's army, Lincoln wrote, "Again, my dear General, I do not believe you appreciate the magnitude of the misfortune involved in Lee's escape. He was within your easy grasp, and to have closed upon him would, in connection with our other late successes, have ended the war. As it is, the war will be prolonged indefinitely. If you could not safely attack Lee last Monday, how could you possibly do so south of the river when you can take with you very few more than 2/3 of the force you then had in hand?" But again, Lincoln compromised on the potential of being overly critical. Realizing that the realities of war are complicated and harsh enough, Lincoln never sent the letter. The Battle of Gettysburg. The South had its own set of internal conflicts and compromises. With far fewer soldiers and less money than the North, the South had fought a large portion of the war in their own territory. But in 1863, General Robert E. Lee made the compromise to launch a political attack over a military attack by invading a supply target in the Northern Territory. The result wasn't good for the South.
But as Lee's main force moves north, a skirmish erupts in Gettysburg between two cavalry units. Lee gets word of the skirmish and is told that a major Union force is at Gettysburg. Instead of sending a cavalry reconnaissance force to confirm the report, Lee orders his entire army to mobilize. It's a colossal mistake. Lee immediately sees the danger of the Union's position. But because Union troops are still straggling in, he believes they are vulnerable. Union reinforcements soon arrive and strengthen their position. At Gettysburg, Lee doesn't adjust his strategy to the situations on the ground. He refuses to retreat, even when the situation is clearly hopeless.
At Gettysburg, General Lee's refusal to compromise is responsible for a critical and bloody loss. Reconstruction. At the end of the Civil War, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments were written, and black officials were almost immediately elected to government. But President Andrew Johnson believed strongly in the Southern states' right to govern themselves. That compromise to appease the South may have helped to avoid guerrilla warfare, but it did little to protect free black Americans. Southern resentment led to violence and discrimination. Southern lands distributed to free slaves reverted back to its pre-war owners. And the state's right to self-govern led to a series of laws known as Black Codes, which restricted the activities of freed slaves and retained them as a cheap labor source. The Compromise of 1877. Reconstruction ended with the election of 1877. Rutherford Hayes ran for president, promising that the South could continue to govern themselves. The North knew this would mean that freed black Americans would continue to suffer. When the outcome of that election was debatable, the Compromise of 1877 allowed both the North and the South to give a little and get a little. The Democrats agreed not to block Hayes' victory if the rights of African Americans were respected and Republican troops were pulled out of the South. This gave Democrats full control of the army and restored a balance of power to the Union. However, it would not be for another 100 years before African Americans began to see their civil rights restored. Conflict and compromise often require sacrifice. Sometimes it also requires suffering. In the end, it was neither the Confederate or Union soldiers that sacrificed the most over the conflict of slavery.